But Feanor spoke then and cried bitterly, "For the less, even as for the greater, there is some deed that he may accomplish but once only, and in that deed his heart shall rest. It may be that I can unlock my jewels, but never again shall I make their like. And if I must break them, I shall break my heart, and I shall be slain, first of all the Eldar in Aman." Hey everyone, Yoyston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we are tackling a question I had originally gotten for a Westerness podcast on Patreon, and I wanted to do a bit more of a deep dive in its own video. We will discuss why weren't more One Rings made, and why weren't more Silmarils forged, if all of these things were so important. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. When we approached this topic on the podcast, my co-host Royan brought up this excellent point about masterworks, that in ancient times, when someone who was rather proficient in a field became a master, a blacksmith for instance, they would build at times a masterwork, perhaps their greatest creation that they would ever make to show their worth as a master artisan in that field, or as I put it in the podcast, a magnum opus, usually the thing that creator might be remembered for. And so it seems that in many ways Tolkien put this practice into place. We have a select few craftsmen in the tales from Middle-earth, such as Feanor, Celebrimbor, Telkar, and Sauron, we'll say, even though there are many others. For one like Aule, he may call the dwarves his masterwork, or even the physical world of Arda that he shaped with rock and fire. But he's a bit more complex to look at specifically since he's a god, or a Vala. So let's examine those other craftsmen I mentioned. Feanor, of course, had many great works, such as potentially the Palantiri, but honestly, those other works, mostly unknown to us the audience, were still lesser in quality and power than the Silmarils, which were his magnum opus. As he states, there are some tasks for all that may be only done once and never replicated, and for him, that was the crafting of the Silmarils. For Celebrimbor, I might imagine his masterwork was the 3 elven rings. And while he never necessarily states that he could or could not make any more, they were certainly dearer to him than anything else he had made, and no amount of torture from Sauron would make him give up the location of those rings and their bearers. For Telkar the dwarf, it is harder to know what his one masterwork was in particular, as he forged quite a few great things, but I would argue that it was likely Narsil, as that sword survived for the longest amount of time out of any of his creations, I believe, and had the greatest destiny, at least, out of all of his crafts. For Sauron, of course, his magnum opus was the One Ring. In the Fellowship of the Ring film, there is a quote from Galadriel's narration at the beginning of the movie that states this perfectly. "And into his ring he poured his cruelty, his malice, and his will to dominate all life, one ring to rule them all." That is exactly right, and I would even add more to this. He gave to this ring a portion of his spirit, a portion of his Feia, as the elves would call it, to give this ring near life itself. This diminished Sauron when he did not possess the ring himself, but obviously it gave him many advantages as well, such as never truly diminishing to a state of the equivalent of death, not while the ring persisted at least. He was the One Ring, and the One Ring was him. That is why it could also never be used for good and always tempted others towards tyranny and evil, for eventually Sauron's spirit would always win in the end unless somehow the ring was destroyed. And that is why so many of my theories as well concerning the ring end in sorrow. Now, the overall question remains, if Sauron could not build another One Ring, as he put so much of his power and energy into the first ring and could not do it again, or Feanor could not build more Silmarils for the same reason, why didn't others create those things again? For the former, out of anyone that could potentially build another One Ring, Saruman almost did. And I believe, if given enough time and ring lore, he might have forged a ring not quite as strong, but almost comparable to the One Ring. I deem this to be true as, like Sauron, Saruman was a Maya who had trained under Aule, and he had much knowledge and a great deal of power in his own right. Yet I still don't think, even if he had found some way to forge a likened ring to the One Ring, it couldn't really be replicated because so much of the One Ring's power and dominance comes from its position as the ruling ring, the one above the 19 other notable rings of power. And if the same ring lore was used, another ring, even forged by Saruman, would do one of two things. Either it would fall into the servitude of the One Ring, being crafted as a legacy of Sauron's ring lore, and therefore falling into that thraldom of Sauron's greatest masterwork, the One. Or Saruman's potential One Ring would have been disconnected from the rings of power that are connected to the One, and therefore, since it wasn't inside of that ring of power network, it would lose a great deal of its potential, as it wouldn't be connected to those others, nor would it have this tyranny over them. Indeed, the Two Ring, as I tend to call it from the Shadow of War games, would actually run into some of these issues. Now, I believe the first thought there would have likely rung true, and even if Saruman would have put a great deal of power into another One Ring type of object, at the end of the day, I do think that would have been subservient to the One Ring, as the entity behind the creation of any rings of power in the first place was the master of the One. As for the Silmarils, Fëanor was himself a very special elf in his lineage, the fire of his spirit, and the extremity of his passion. He learned skills and secrets from others, including Aule the Smith, that likely another student would not be given as easily, nor hone as well as Fëanor did. And of course, when the two trees of Valinor were destroyed, their light could not be used for the creation of more Silmarils. Although I might suppose that some future crafter could have used the sun and moon in the same way, if any such craftsman ever came to be. Yet, there would be no such person, elf or otherwise, that would come again that could do something like create Silmarils. Another theme that we see over and over in so many different ways throughout Tolkien's works is the degradation of certain power or magic or majesty over time, and we certainly see that in this conversation. Things that were forged in the First Age could hardly, if at all, be replicated in the Second, or the Second, the Third, let alone from the Valiant years before the First Age even began. There is a loss of primordial power, lore, and wisdom from the ancient days in the timeline of Arda, and this is the case for the Silmarils in the One Ring and so forth, I'm sure. So, those are my thoughts on why more One Rings or Silmarils or anything else of great renown could not be forged again. Certainly from a meta-writing perspective, this would have also lessened the quality of the story if there was some way to craft another. But I believe it's one of those topics that actually couples the lore reasoning very well with the meta-writing reasoning, creating a good spot in the world where such artifacts could exist and not be replicated in a way that makes sense. And so we come to the end of our tale. From this story we see a clear message. There are a great many things of quality, whether artifacts or experiences or so forth, that may only happen once, and we must enjoy them for what they are, rather than seeking to replicate that which cannot be made again. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts on all of this? Let me know in the comments below. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles from our friends Mythologie Candles, or order some Weta or United Cutlery Lord of the Rings sword statues, or other replicas from Castle Kon, who does international shipping, and please use the code WEST at checkout, and check out our merch and Patreon as well. Thanks to our Valar tier patrons and YouTube members, Peter Shepard, Merton, John Hume, Elizabeth Calvert, Maz Gibbs, Reese Jenkins, Arthur Merlin, Dale Davis, Kingswald Project, Theodore, Moon Viper, Andrew Carlisle, and Zumi. Thank you so much to all of our patrons and YouTube members. It really means a lot. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today. And I'll see you all again next week with a video on how I would do a TV show set in the Third Age. My friends, happy holidays, Merry Christmas. Thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.